This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. Joining me this week, two bandmates with a song in their hearts who came ready to shred. Paul Jasley.
Hello.
And Kara Shamborski.
Guitar solo.
Oh my gosh, we are so musically inclined today here on IRCB because we have a very special topic that we're going to be going into. But before I get into that, I do want to make two quick announcements. One, we have a Discord hangout coming out on February 20th at 8 p.m. So if you haven't come to one of those, it's a super awesome, fun time where we just kind of chat with everybody that shows up. And we're bringing people on like it's a talk show. So you get unmuted and you come and you talk to us for a few minutes. And then, we rotate through everybody. And then after about an hour or so, we open it up to just everybody kind of talking. These things can go for hours and hours and hours. I think the last one, some folks were on until 2 a.m. It's a lot of fun. Highly recommend you be there. That's February 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Discord. So make sure you're on our Discord. The other thing I want to do is I want to shout out some of our latest patrons. That would be Matt, Kyle, Jolamprix, and Jason. Welcome to the club. You guys are amazing. I can't wait to hear what you guys think of all of the backlog of Patreon episodes that you got. Saga of Saga, IRCB Movie Club, Mike and Paul read Doom Patrol. I still love that series. It's very close to my heart. But yeah, so thank you guys for joining the Patreon. We're really excited to have you. Now, let's get into the actual show. Let me ask the question that I'm legally obligated to ask every single week. How have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kara.
We are less than a week out from my birthday, Mike. So I am in treat yourself birthday mode.
Yeah.
A lot.
I mean, understandable, right? Because what is time? It's birth month for you as far as you're concerned, right?
It really is. You know what I bought myself? So fans of The Mandalorian who are also Disney merchandise nerds, as we know that is a thing that I am now, might recall that when the first season of The Mandalorian dropped, there was no merchandise because they had such a tight lid on the baby that there was nothing because they didn't want any leaks, and it worked. The appearance of that little fucker was oh my god. So but then of course everyone was but I love the kid, I want stuff with the kid on it. But you can't just snap your fingers and have merchandise appear unless you've got a screen printing setup for t-shirts and can just start rambling them off. But Disney and Disney started doing that almost instantly, but anything besides t-shirts needed more time. So right. It was big news when there was new merchandise. And so one of the first things that was announced was this backpack. Disney fans will know that the company Loungefly makes Disney mini backpacks, and each one has a different design and they sell out all the time. It's like Funko Pops, but for backpacks. I have 4. And so
Kara.
So that's not really bad though. So Loungefly was hey, we made a backpack and it's got the kid on it. And so the backpack just looks like you're carrying the baby on your back. And it was a really good design. Not photorealistic, but you could tell it was definitely the kid, the way the kid looked on the show. And I was I need this friggin' backpack. And then because people are terrible, they were oh no, he looks so grumpy and old, make him cute. So Loungefly redesigned the backpack to make him cute and smiling and young looking, and they gave him a glow up on his skin. And I was but he's not cute. He's cute, but he's a tiny carnivorous monster. He's not the smiling thing that keeps popping up on Etsy on get in loser, we're getting chicken nuggies sweatshirts. I cannot deal with how bad so much of the Grogu merchandise is because people insist on making him too cute. He's already cute. Why do you need to make... He's not smiling. I've counted. He smiles 4 times in the whole show. Stop making him smile on the merchandise. Anyway, so all of this is to let you know that, one of my pandemic coping mechanisms, which is why I know so much about Disney merchandise these days, is just going on the Shop Disney website randomly, because sometimes they just have a sale and they don't tell you about it. And anyway, so the other day I went on and they were new Mandalorian merchandise. And I was well, I don't want to keep my money. Let me click that link. And one of the first items on the page is the original backpack design. And I lost my mind. And I was like, this is an error. They definitely uploaded the wrong photo and didn't notice it. So I tweeted at the Shop Disney support Twitter and I was like, hey, is this image incorrect or is this actually like the original design? And they replied like, the photos on our website are accurate. And so I screenshotted that reply and I screenshotted the image that I purchased. And if this backpack arrives and it's the smiley, happy, like boomer-fied Yoda, I'm gonna be so mad. But if it's grumpy Grogu, I am gonna be the happiest birthday girl ever.
Kira's only feelings are like anger beyond recognition of the universe and so happy that nothing matters except for the thing that just happened. I love it. I love it.
So that's where I'm at. In terms of comics.
Thank you.
In terms of comics, so Mike, you don't know this, but you're basically my like curator of what new thing I will read because you have good recommendations. So
yes, finally,
right.
6 years, I'm finally recognized.
So recently you mentioned the Immortal Iron Fist series that Marvel had from 2006 to 2009, and you were like, it's so awesome, you gotta try. I'm like, okay, Mike. So I got Immortal Iron Fist Volume 1 on Hoopla, and I started reading it, and I spent most of my time being confused, but only partially for the reasons you think, because for some reason I had not looked at the years this comic was published before starting to read it. Thought for some reason that it was only a couple years old and was very confused by all this like registration talk going on throughout the book. And I was like, wait a minute. So I'm halfway through the book and I'm like, I don't know what's happening here. So then I exit out of the book and I look at the publication date and I was like, oh, this is a Civil War era book. I didn't read that one. What do I do? So it's like, so you know, it was just kind of a weird experience because I remember seeing Civil War comics. Like that's all you saw when you went into a comic book shop in like 2005, 2006. And, you know, I was reading all the DC crap at the time. And I remember that feeling of like reading a DC book and only understanding the greater context of what was happening because I was also reading the event book at the time. And so I felt like while I was reading Immortal Iron Fist, that it probably would have helped if I knew what the hell was going on in Civil War because they referenced it so many times and I was just so lost.
I'm sorry, Kara. I forgot that book was like a Civil War
like, book, Mike. Book. Yeah. That said, I only knew the character Iron Fist through like a few episodes of The Defenders that I saw because everyone had said to skip the miniseries on Netflix of Iron Fist himself. And I was like, okay. And so I only really knew that like he's a white boy with martial arts. And I felt like that was enough to start with. And the book did a good job of kind of explaining who that character was, which I appreciated. And I did like the whole, like through the first volume, I did get the sense of, okay, Danny's not just like this arbitrary white boy chosen by this like mythical semi-Tibetan dragon being to have like the ultimate power of kung fu. It's like he's the most recent in a long line of Iron Fists going back like 1,000 years, and having the comic book show some of those past Iron Fists doing their thing in their time period. I liked that part immensely. It made me feel like this dude was not just like, let's take advantage of all these kung fu movies and capitalize on it. And oh, look, he's still around because we can't let go of things from the Silver Age. It was more like, oh, we found like a way to make this character relevant and interesting beyond like taking advantage of a cultural moment 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Jesus. Yeah. So overall, I am interested enough to keep reading to volume 2, but I'm really mad that they made a lot of it dependent on what was happening in Civil War. Because if I was just if I was a casual reader and you had told me to read this book, I would have just been frustrated the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I totally forgot that there was like Civil War bits and pieces of it, because honestly the stuff that really makes that book soar is in my mind is what happens, I think, after the initial arc. Everything gets very independent and on its own. So I think like if you continue, I think you'll be really really happy. And I think I really love this series, and I love the Dwayne Straczynski run that happens after Ed Brubaker and Matt Fraction run on this. So I don't know. I think it's really good from beginning to end. For 27 issues, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna keep going. Like I said, I'm intrigued, and it was also interesting because I was like, wait, I like Fraction and how do I pronounce his name? David Aja.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, I like their stuff. And then I was reading it and I was like, this feels not like Hawkeye. And then I realized the dates and I was like, this is 10 years before Hawkeye. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you kind of start to see some, like, there are definitely some panels where I was like, ooh, they used that. This is like a theme through the work into the Hawkeye series that we all know and love.
That was my one complaint when I was reading the Hawkeye book, was like, it felt like David Aja just reused some of his, like he reused Danny Rand, but just in a different costume in some places. But like, that's not a really knock on the book. It's just like similar, his art is very similar.
You notice it enough. Yeah. I mean, that's like everything Jen Bartel draws looks the same, but
right.
I like it, but that's what it is.
Yeah. Sean Phillips. Yeah. There's a whole plenty of creators we could talk about that.
And super briefly also, I know we don't really talk about comic strips on this podcast, but I feel like we've all name dropped Calvin and Hobbes enough where I am allowed to talk about Garfield for a minute. Sure. And
wait, did you say Garfield?
Garfield.
Okay, Paul, how have you been? How have comic books been?
No, let me talk. I get it. Garfield, to many people, is like a lowest common denominator of comic strip humor. But I spent a significant amount of time as a child reading those comic strips, and I had a shitty week. So I decided to go down that particular memory lane. And I was reminded of how funny some of the strips actually are. Like, Garfield gets a bad rap, and a lot of that is justifiable because there are only so many times you can create a daily 3-panel comic strip with a character with a set like range of situations and character traits and make those fresh every time. It is just not going to happen. That said, the early 90s Jim Davis stuff on Garfield is pretty fire. Like, it's not the most intellectual of humor, but I laughed. I still laugh. Some of it's genuinely funny. Like, that guy gets the beats of those 3 panels down, and I'm just going to say it. I'm a Garfield apologist. I don't think it's the best work in the world. I think it's funny, and I think that people are allowed to like it at the end.
I was just giving you, guff for a minute there. I think, Garfield's not too bad. I think like it's become memeified, so it feels like it's lesser, but like, it's a staple. It's a staple of the Sunday newspaper, right?
Yeah, I mean, I said, the early 90s stuff and the late 80s stuff, which is the stuff that I grew up reading, is actually pretty good. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for the 2000s in any way, but everything before that, check it out.
Right. You heard it here first. IRCB now recommends Garfield comics. Paul, how are you? How have you been? All that stuff. How have comics been?
I had my fair share of dog-eared Garfield collections when I was a kid, so I totally get it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Things are good here. We're basically snowed in here in West Michigan. It's been we had a pretty mild winter so far, but we definitely got our fair share of snow over the past couple of days. So I'm putting off shoveling as long as I can. I'll probably get out there and do that after we're done recording. But in terms of comics, I've been reading a lot of stuff. I am, as the kids say these days, I am back on my bullshit, reading the Judge Dredd Complete Case Files. I had picked up volume 10 some point last year and just got distracted. So I finally picked up the Complete Case Files volume 10 and started working my way through that. This is a collection that collects the Judge Dredd strips from 2000 AD, progs 474 to 522. That's around 1986 to 87. Or if you're in Mega City 1, that covers the year 2108 and 2109. this was a really fun collection. This volume 10 has a lot of really short stories in it. A lot of them are just one and done Judge Dredd strips. I think the longest ones are only like 3 chapters. So really quick, fun to read. All of these were written by John Wagner and Alan Grant, who are kind of the key important Dredd writers in the 80s. And you have a murderer's row of artists working on this book. You have Kevin O'Neill, Steve Dillon, Brendan McCarthy, Ron Smith, Cam Kennedy, Barry Kitson. Jeez. It looks great. It's so cool. Again, any British comic book creator at some point probably drew a Dredd story for 2000 AD. It's the way it worked out,
Kind of like how they all ended up in Harry Potter if you're an actor in Britain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of fun to read this stuff because, again, this is a weekly series, and when you're kind of binge reading it, you kind of notice trends in a lot of the stories. There is a sequence where I think it's like 3 stories in a row that end with Judge Dredd sending someone to the psycho cubes instead of the, ISO cubes, because they're dealing with mental illness. There's a story about someone with multiple personality disorder. And there's also a lot of weird body horror in this volume. So I wonder what John Wagner and Alan Grant were watching or consuming at the time when they're writing this stuff, kind of comes out through the Judge Dredd stories. There's a story about a mother whose name is Sigourney, oddly enough, who takes her kids to another planet on vacation. They contract a disease and all turn into aliens that look a lot like xenomorphs, hence the name Sigourney. And it's really gruesome that these kids are running around eating all of their neighbors because they turned into aliens. There's another story about a guy playing a Santa Claus, like a bell ringer outside, dressed up like Santa Claus. And he has a window in his forehead where he can see his brain sloshing around. It's just weird body horror type stuff like that.
What?
It's really strange. But there's there's also the other thing I love about Judge Dredd. It's also very funny. There's a whole strip that is just a joke about George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley from the band Wham and how they broke up, because they must have broken up around this time. Because there's a strip where it's 2 guys, one from Andrew Ridgeley block, and who's the guy in Wham who's not George Michael, and the other guy from George Michael block, and they fight because those 2 blocks hate each other. So you're like, they wrote an 8-page story about Wham for no reason. It's just like the most throwaway story, and I love that they did that. In addition to the more gruesome, typical Dredd stuff. So it's a really fun to read that stuff.
I mean, when you're putting out a weekly book like that, anything goes, right? Why not? Why not have an issue about Wham breaking up?
Exactly. Yeah, and if you're like me and you don't realize that you're reading it in the year 2021, you're like, Andrew Ridgeley, that's the guy from Wham. Oh my gosh, the Andrew Ridgeley block is right next to George Michael block. Oh my gosh, this is a joke about Wham. It was such a funny moment, and I enjoyed it so much. The other thing I read that I wanted to talk about briefly is DCeased Dead Planet number 7, which is the final issue in the DCeased Dead Planet series, written by Tom Taylor with art by Trevor Hairsine. I have to tip my hat to Tom Taylor. He somehow managed to do a very engaging, satisfying, and surprisingly enjoyable zombie story. I mean, this DC stuff, it's been continually impressive how he's been able to keep the story going. And this feels like the last story because it kind of reaches a satisfying conclusion at the end. So zombie stories are about the most worn out and tired feeling genre convention you can think of, but he managed to make it exciting. I think mainly because he focused on making it a superhero story first. This issue opens with some of our remaining heroes fighting off an army of Amazo androids. And if you're a DC fan like me, that's exactly what you want from a superhero comic,
I'm still stuck on the name DCeased. It really took them 75 years to get to that. Fun. Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's so dumb that it comes back around to being clever. It's one of those things.
Right.
Which I appreciate. And what I really liked about this Dead Planet series I want to mention also is that Tom Taylor focused on some of the more obscure aspects of the DC universe. There's a lot of magic characters in this book, which I've always liked the magic connected stuff in DC. And the whole 7-issue story, you kind of follow John Constantine as he's on a mission to collect all of these important magical objects like Madame Xanadu's crystal ball and the Spear of Destiny. And it all pays off in this issue. He makes John Constantine kind of the hero of this Dead Planet series in a really interesting way. That's a character I don't not read a lot of, but the way he handles it, I found really engaging and interesting. So Tom Taylor's becoming one of those writers where I haven't read a ton of his stuff, but I'm willing to give pretty much anything he's written a chance because I've enjoyed it all so far.
Yeah, that was me with Al Ewing for a while, where I hadn't read a lot of his stuff, but every single time I read it, he knocked it out of the park, obviously with his Immortal Hulk and all that other stuff. But even before that, I think I had read just little bits and pieces of his work and always enjoyed it. And I think Tom Taylor's also becoming the same thing for me. And now, everybody keeps talking about this DCeased thing. I feel like I should maybe get on board. Both you and Brian can enjoy it. That's crazy to me. That's insane.
To clarify, I have not read it. I have not read it because I'm so over their stupid event addiction. But you know what? I get it. It makes money.
I think
people
this
like it.
This one stands on its own. You can read this without knowing anything about the other death metal or big DCU stuff. It kind of stands on its own. And again, if both me and Brian, who come from DC from very different angles, can enjoy it, I think it speaks to its accessibility. And quality. So
exactly.
Well,
exactly.
I mean, you're definitely making me a little intrigued with the whole DC magic wielders thing. That is one of my favorite aspects of their universe. See, now if you told me the Spectre was involved or my boy Ragman, then we could be having a slightly more interested conversation. But Constantine, I'm on the fence.
I don't want to give anything away, but you might be pleasantly surprised by some of the people that show up and some of the things that show up. You want to see Zatanna and the Phantom Stranger fight Trigon? This is the book for you. So.
Okay. All right. I'll think about it.
I don't know what any of those words mean, but you know what? It sounds exciting.
Mike, I don't know how to... Trigon is a demon from another dimension. He's Raven's dad.
Let's get into it in the break. We don't have time to go through the history of the DC universe quite yet, but really quick. So this week for me has been so busy. I've played more tabletop RPG games in the last week and some change than I have in a very long time. I keep saying yes to games and I don't know why. So I've just been, when I'm not reading assigned homework reading for the show in some capacity, whether it's Hikaru no Go, book club stuff, IRCB movie club stuff, or just trying to read a couple X-Men books so that I can be prepared for this episode. I was playing D&D pretty much, and catching up on Cinema at the Cinema because I hate myself. I love that show to death. I watch Mr. America, and it's a god-awful mess that is beautiful from beginning to end. But Paul, I for some reason think that you watched that show. I don't know why I think that. Have you watched any of the On Cinema at the Cinema stuff from Tim Heidecker and Greg Turkington?
I've just a few things years ago. I'm so far behind on that stuff. So, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay. Anyway, so if anybody out there watches that ridiculous stuff that's kind of on Adult Swim, let me know. But otherwise, I did read a couple comic books that weren't assigned reading, like Hikaru no Go and stuff like that. I read Abbott 1973 #1. This is Saladin Ahmed with Sammy Cavella. Ultimately, if you liked Abbott, you're going to love this book because it's a direct sequel. It's like he picks up after a little bit of time. And what I think is really interesting is that this first issue gets you right back up to speed, and it gets you into the gear of just continuing the story. There's like a 2.5 page summary of what happened in the first arc of Abbott, which I thought is really interesting. I think that makes it really new reader friendly, and I really like the new challenges that Ahmed has brought to the book for Abbott to face. It's not just her trying to keep her job. Now she's got this job at this newspaper that's all African Americans, and they all work for this one guy, and somebody comes in from corporate, and there's like that aspect of her job where it's not her trying to keep her job, it's her trying to deal with the hardships of working at a small newspaper. Plus there is some big like overarching
thing with all of the evil magicians in the world. Plus, she's got some relationship issues that she needs to work through. I really like the multifaceted bits and pieces of this book. I think Ahmed has written. I think this is going to be another miniseries, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that there's a lot to cram into this book, but it doesn't feel overwhelming. It doesn't feel like he's going to leave one storyline to the side. The one thing I'll say is that I know that some people don't like these on again, off again miniseries style comics where it's like 5 issues on or 6 issues on, and then we don't know when the next volume is going to come out, and we don't know if it's going to be considered volume 2 or something like that. But I honestly love it. I think it's a great way for me to like take a breath, like between seasons of a TV show. Like a good, 10 episode, 13 episode TV show for a whole year is a great amount of television for me. And I think that like 6 to 8 issues per season of a comic book is perfect as well. I think that I don't know, this book is fantastic, and I think that I'd rather give these creators time to create a really good, concise 6-issue like arc like once a year versus having to bang out 12 issues in a year, because I think that it can be tiresome, and honestly it allows me to check out other books. When this book is off season, I get to pick up other books, and so I like that that they give you this range of being able to either read it month to month, or you can wait until the arc is done and then you can binge it without ever feeling like you're behind. So I really appreciate that, and this book is fantastic. If you didn't read the first one, go read it. It's a beautiful book, and this new one is just as great. The other thing I want to talk about really quick is 7 Secrets, number 1 through 6. I read all of the issues that are out. This is Tom Taylor, Danielle De Niculo, Walter Baiamonte, and letters by Ed Dukeshire. I'm a little late to the game on this book. I grabbed number 1, I think, when it came out because it looked really interesting. Tom Taylor is this hot new thing, as we've talked about. I think I mentioned this in like episode 267, and our friend that came on the show for that episode, Kevin, was like, Mike, you've got to read this. And we talked about it like after the show. And so I finally picked up the rest of the issues, and I don't know why I slept on this book, because Tom Taylor knows how to tell a really fun, engaging story that's very dynamic and very bright and exciting. It sucks you right in from the beginning. And I think like he knows how to create these worlds that are like, at least for this book, it's like a very hard set of boxes that you're not supposed to break outside of, and then explosively destroy them after a few issues once you get used to the status quo. And so if you don't know what this book is, ultimately it's about a secret society who protects the 7 secrets of the world. Each secret has a keeper and a holder. And the question is, what if those 2 people fell in love and had a kid? Where do their allegiances lie? What happens to the kid? And that's basically how this story starts. Our main character, Casper, is this kid who was born out of a secret keeper and a holder falling in love and having a kid, and they don't know what to do with the kid. And the secret society doesn't know what to do with the kid, though they hint at this maybe having happened before. We get to see him come of age in this first arc, and ultimately building up to a very, very brilliantly done climax of the first arc. And I think that anybody who reads this book will immediately be sucked in. This is one of those books that reminds me of Saga in that it is so bingeable. It's so like, it feels so personable because there's this ongoing narration of that Casper is giving as the story goes on, where he's kind of telling you everything that's happened. So he knows what's happening, and you get this sense of like, he's not telling you things in certain moments, and then he reveals it later. And it's really well done, where you can tell it's someone writing a story about someone telling a story. It reminds me, again, like of Saga and plenty of other books that have done this. And the art in this book, like Di Niculo and Baiamonte, their pencil inks and colors all together are extremely gorgeous. Like every page is action packed and feels really excited. There's a lot of energy on every page. Every character has just brilliant facial expressions, and the action in this book is like incomparable. Like I can't find another book that has such great action that also is really fun and exciting. I mean, because you can go pick up a Capes book and you can see a lot of action, and everyone just looks angry and they're fighting and everything's dark, whereas this book feels really bright. Like, I don't know what it is, but the color palette of it just feels really like animated, like a cartoon in some ways, where there's just a lot more brightness to the action. Yeah, I think that if anybody picks this book up, they're going to be screaming and yelling that the next volume isn't out yet. So I highly recommend 7 Secrets 1 through 6. It is beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah, I guess we've got to move because we're already running behind. So I'd love to talk more about these books, but let's get into comic picks. Comic books are coming out on February 10th, 2021. What are you both excited for this week? Let's start with you, Paul.
I'm excited for Homesick Pilots number 3. This is by Dan Waters with art by Casper Weingard. I picked up the first issue of this on a whim just because I kind of like the cover, and I was kind of hooked. It's set in 1994. It follows a teenage high school band named Homesick Pilots, and the lead singer, Amy, I think she's the lead singer, I don't remember. Anyway, one of the members of the band, Amy, goes into a haunted house and disappears. So it turns into a sort of a punk rock haunted house story. She has to go hunt down some ghosts that are a part of this house. And the last issue, issue 2, really expanded the story in a really interesting way. So I don't want to give too much away because I think this is a series that might be a sleeper hit that I think a lot of people are going to discover once it hits trade. But suffice to say, it really hits the sweet spots for me in terms of a horror story, being creepy, capturing that sort of 90s music scene. And there are a couple great Ramones references in the second issue. So I was hooked with that, right away. So if you're talking about the Ramones in a comic book, it's for me. So there you go.
Definitely. I will say Saint in the Discord chat also picked this book because as they said, it hits their love for 90s rock, which I think is totally accurate in some ways. It feels, the book to me when I read it felt like kind of grungy, even though I know they're trying to be more like 80s. It's like 70s, 80s punk rockers. But yeah, Kara, what about you? What are you excited for this week?
Okay, so I need to slightly yell about DC again, which I really. So DC has an 80-page special out this week called DC Love is a Battlefield #1. I see friend of the show Danny has also selected this as his pick of the week. Good pick, but I'm going to yell about it because I'm always interested in this kind of collection that DC does. I am excited that the solicit says there's a story about Amanda Waller and like a blind date situation, and Amanda Waller in the comics is always kind of right. So she's always kind of represented as this like she is nicknamed the Wall. She is just this suit who does all the shady government shit in the DC universe, and she's always kind of given that. She's never really given a lot of character depth. She's just like, that's the Wall. So it's nice that they acknowledge even in a one-shot standalone short story in a larger compilation that perhaps she might have a social life. But the thing I want to yell about is so petty, but here we are. So in the solicit, DC is like, all your favorite OTPs are here. And I'm like, bold of you, DC, to assume who my OTPs are in your DC, universe.
Are you telling me that there's a Harley Ivy going on a date, kissing, making out, being in love story? Because I'm pretty sure most DC fans feel that way, and I guarantee you're not printing that.
Well, that's the cover. The cover is them, so they're at least queer baiting, if not doing an actual story. No,
oh my
I mean,
God.
So this is just making me yell because, periodically I come back around to the idea that Batman and Superman should be together, and then I realize they will never do that for many reasons, but because it would either break the universe entirely, because the entire thing would just be about Batman emotionally hurting Superman because he doesn't want to have nice things, or Batman would get over all his bullshit because he would be so in love that he would just not be who he is anymore, and that would also not work. So, because their dynamic would work so well, because Superman is the man of tomorrow. He gets his power from the sun. He's all shiny and optimistic and shit. And Batman literally lives in the dark in his past. It's the total opposites attract situation. And Batman would be all in his bullshit about but my parents are dead and I have a mission and I'm angsty. And Superman would be like, oh, you just need cuddles. So I think it would be great, but it will never happen. And this is why I read fan fiction.
Yes, Danny in the chat is asking for some fanfic.
But anyone who's read the Batman Superman series from the mid 2000s, that whole first volume, it's literally just them it's just them narrating over one another. They're basically thinking the same thing at the same time, just on their parallel lines in their own personas, and you're like, God damn it, just kiss already, you absolute idiots. So,
Oh my goodness. Well, we will definitely try to find some fanfic for that. That's PG-13. And we'll pass it along to the Discord folks only.
Oh my God.
My pick for this week, I guess before I get into my pick, it's 2021 and we're trying to do something where we want people to read comic books. So if you share the show on social media and tag us on Instagram or Twitter, you are entered to potentially win a $20 gift card to Comixology, Midtown Comics, or your local comic shop if they offer that, whichever you prefer. So because this year, like I said, we want to help people read comic books. So if you go ahead and do that, we can make that happen. This is like a one person per year kind of thing, but we really want to help folks read some comics. Anyways, our Discord picks for this week. Some of the folks on Discord threw us their comic picks for this week. Danny said that he's up for DC Love is a Battlefield with Kara. Crashmore said that he's up for Undiscovered Country number 12. Saint said they're up for Homesick Pilots number 3. I'm very excited about all of those books. Actually, I haven't read any Undiscovered Country, but I've heard it's pretty good. My pick for this week, though, is Radiant Black number 1. This is Kyle Higgins with art by Marcelo Costa. This looks like some standard superhero in a suit that gives you powers fare, but I'm willing to try it. I'm adding in like a dash of or the story, I should say, it adds in a dash of like cosmic powers are coming to get you, and I think that I actually like that. Like these elder space gods want to steal back this superhero suit that this character this guy gets. I'm all about that. If anything that's larger than life and larger than being tries to destroy me, I'm basically here to read that. I like Kyle Higgins' writing. I like the book Cowl that he wrote. I've read some of his other stuff too. I really enjoyed it. And the solicit says that it's for fans of Invincible and Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. So like, hell yeah, that's me. That's absolutely me to a T. I did notice that Marcelo Costa did some issues of Greg Pak's Firefly and TMNT Shredder in Hell. But from the previews, his art looks pretty solid. It kind of reminds me of Ryan Otley and Jason Howard, like, again, Invincible, Astounding Wolfman stuff that like is right up my alley. And I think he's definitely leaning into those kinds of styles to make it look a bit more Robert Kirkman style superhero-y. But nonetheless, it looks like standard superhero stuff, but that's not a bad thing for a book that's, about a superhero. So I'm definitely intrigued to try this. Image has been pushing this like crazy, so I'm excited to just see what this first issue is about. And who knows, I may just get in on like another superhero book that's supposed to be an ongoing. So fingers crossed that it gets past 6 issues. Yeah, I don't know. I guess we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about music and comics and how you enjoy a static medium's interpretation of a fluid medium. And so we're gonna talk all about that. We've got so many screenshots in our notes, it's disgusting. We'll be back in just a second. For our show this week, we are talking about music in comic books. How do you enjoy a static medium's interpretation of a fluid medium? Paul and Kara were bullying me right inside the break to try to do something really clever and fun, like count us down. I just can't do it. So, anyways, we're here to talk about that.
Yeah.
I want to count you in. I'm not a front man like that, right? I feel like I'm the guy who's running the...
You're literally the front man, Mike.
Right.
Wait, shit. No, this is a really interesting topic because I think I've avoided it. I've intentionally avoided it on the like backlog of topic lists that we have because I just don't know how to talk about it. Like I don't know what to say about it. I feel like I don't have anything interesting to say about it. And then Paul pitched it to the show when we were trying to shop around some ideas. Says, hey, we got this in the backlog. What if we approached it this way? Because I was kind of asking what we could talk about other than just quote music and comics. What would be the thing that we go into? And Paul pitched this idea of like analyzing or understanding how music is portrayed in comics. And after we got to talking about it, I realized, holy shit, there's actually quite a lot that we can go into. Mm-hmm. So I guess Paul, I want to kick it over to you because I know you had some ideas around this. Sure. And it made me really excited about this topic.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe it's just me severely missing the experience of going to see live music, for the past year.
Oh, for sure.
But I've been really thinking about this topic a lot, and there's something about that experience of being in the crowd, watching a band. There's an energy, there's a sound, and there's something intangible about all that that's almost impossible to capture in comics, obviously, since you're dealing with a comic book being silent and static. It's very hard to show sound, or portray or convey what something sounds like. So I was kind of thinking of examples, and for me, a lot of the times musical sequences in comics can look sort of stiff or staged or awkward, and it's not a put down to the artist because, it's incredibly difficult to portray that stuff effectively. So I wanted to find some examples of how it works and maybe a couple different types of examples. I think, so we threw some examples together and trying to pin down different ways to have you quote unquote hear what's happening on the panel or on the page while you're reading the comic. So I think we got a bunch of examples. I don't know how you want to start running through them or talking about them, but
I mean, the one that we all read,
yeah, we could start there.
Sure. Yeah, so yeah. I'd pitched a couple examples off the top of my head. One of them was the recent Black Canary series from a few years ago that was written by Brendan Fletcher and art by Annie Wu and Pia Guerra. I remember really, really enjoying the series when it came out, and it did stand out because I think it's one of the better examples of capturing that kinetic energy of a musical performance. All of the members of the band that Black Canary's in look so cool on the page, and it makes you want to hear that band while you're reading the comic.
So I also read this when it came out, and I remember being like, oh, this aesthetic is so cool. But on the reread, I'm just confused. So it's a good thing that the fight scenes, and there are fight scenes more than musical scenes, are so good. And that kind of makes the book worth reading. But the plot, I was confused the entire time.
It's a book that's an aesthetic experience for me more than maybe a story experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm glad you mentioned the fight sequences because I remember there being more musical sequences when, in my memory. But when I went back to go reread it, there are fewer, but they almost function as setups to the fight scenes. So there's the same sort of energy in both the fight scenes and the music scenes, which I think really helps the book because when you see Black Canary standing on stage, she's poised like she's ready to fight. So, you know what I mean? So it's a nice parallel between that energy of a fight scene, which we've all seen in comics, and the energy of a musician or performer would have on stage. It's kind of the same feeling.
Well, they kind of go into that in the book also by saying, hey, Dinah, you don't know how to move on the stage. You're posed like a fighter. Like they literally say this to her, but like throughout the book, they're working on that with her because, and I went into this topic being like, what do I know about music and comic books? And then I was like, oh, that's like 10 things on my bookshelf right now. So, I revisited a bunch of stuff, and there is kind of this through line in a lot of comic books about bands, musical groups, where it's not really about the music, it's about the tension within the band. And so in this particular book, the Black Canary book, it's everyone just kind of being like, well, this superhero was basically thrust on us by the record label with no explanation, and she can sing, but she's not like in it to win it like we are. And so like there's that tension that's coming out. And kind of like Paul said, this was a very aesthetic book, and I get why DC wanted to do this, because they're like, oh yeah, Canary, her superpower is having that canary cry with her vocal cords, and we've had her wearing fishnets for 1,000 years because those are sexy and easy to draw, so why don't we just put her in a band? And it kind of feels like the book itself is almost a meta commentary on what was happening on the editorial side.
Sure.
I get it, but also she's a martial artist. What are you doing?
Yeah, I remember that this book feeling like really clunky, but I do remember seeing like the aesthetic of the band performing and like the handful of moments that we get right before a fight, mind you, where they are performing and playing music. It is very exciting. Like there is an energy that comes out of the book that you can see. And some of the other examples that we have on here, like Scott Pilgrim, and I grabbed some stuff from Gem and the Holograms and from a handful of different manga that Renee had recommended. And there is this consistent thing that you see between all of the books where there are like energy lines coming out of people, and it's not to dictate like their actual movement, but it's like the energy and the sound coming out of their voices and their instruments that I think makes this like it kind of puts you in that mindset of like, if you go to a live show, here's the thing that you kind of pick out, or that you're going to feel when you're there. And it's not like you have a direct connection to like the people or the instruments on stage, but like there is as someone who's been to, quite a few live shows, like there is an energy that exists in the room where live music is playing when it's really, really loud, and you can feel it in your chest and you can feel it in the people around you, like that. You can kind of understand that interpretation in these comics. I think the one thing that we probably aren't going to talk about is like, how do you read music in comics? Because the answer is you don't, because it never makes sense no matter how hard you try. But I think there is like an energy there that I think a lot of artists try to portray that is very hard to grasp. And I think in some of our examples it works, in some of the examples it doesn't. But Paul, I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think some of the examples, especially Gem and the Holograms and even Scott Pilgrim, there is an attempt to sort of abstract the art to convey that sense of energy. You know what I mean? Like it's rather than it looking realistic, it's the artist is drawing what the sound feels like, you know what I mean? And trying to make it look too real or too realistic or stage, and that really helps in those instances. The Gem and the Holograms comic, as a fan of the original cartoon, I think the comic captures the energy of the band better than the cartoon ever did. You know what I mean? It's such a fun looking and engaging, exciting book art wise that I do want to hear those songs, you know what I mean? But you get a sense of kind of what they might sound like, based on hearing the cartoon, but also just the way that's portrayed on the page. There's just such a fun pop sensibility that's just coming through the artwork.
Say how old you are without saying how old you are. I did not grow up watching Gem and the Holograms. I found out about it on the internet when I was in high school.
Okay.
But I see what you're saying about like the energy on the page for Gem being like, oh, I want to hear that music, because I think as much as we talk about, comics, why are you so obsessed with music when music is the one thing you cannot do? I think it's really tapping into kind of like aesthetics are a part of music. Even if your aesthetic is, I'm anti-aesthetic, I just wear a hoodie, like that's still your aesthetic. So it is kind of like when you see how artists are choosing to present themselves, you can kind of see through that presentation on the page what the music is kind of supposed to be sounding like genre wise.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And, the way that they do it in Gem is really interesting because it's Sophie Campbell, I think, does the art for most of the Gem stuff. And the way that they show the way the Gem's music looks and the way the Misfits music looks, it looks different. So you can tell the bands sound different. And it's like, again, it seems like an obvious thing to do, but a lot of artists, a lot of comics don't go that extra step to say different music is going to quote unquote look different, on the page,
right?
Because that's how you're supposed to hear it in your head. So I always appreciated that distinction that she made in the artwork.
I feel like looking at pages of Gem and the Holograms is going to give me cavities. Does that make sense? It's so brightly colored. Like, it's such a beautiful looking comic book. I've never read any of the Gem and Hologram stuff, but man, it's so bright and pastel. It looks just like I'm eating handfuls of candy. Sorry, go ahead, Kara.
So while we're talking about art by Sophie Campbell, we do need to talk about colors by M. Victoria Roboto. I have the Gem and the Holograms Outrageous Edition, which is Gem 1 through 10 and some of the specials. And at the back of it, they have like little one of those series of pages where they break down what they did on each page and why. And so each member of the creative team has their little notes. And actually a lot of the stuff that we're describing about like the mood and the tone shifts, that's all the colorist, and the artist and writer are very vocal about those choices being the colorist just being incredibly good at her job.
That's awesome.
Right. So one of those parts of comics we need to talk about more because it matters. But
I was just going to say that I was going to move on to another comic. So do you have any more thoughts on Gem before I
was ahead? Also going to move on to a different comic. So you go first, Paul.
I was going to say, well, speaking of color, Scott Pilgrim is a book that doesn't have any color, but kind of manages to do a similar move when it's the musical sequences. In that, I guess they did recolor Scott Pilgrim, but I never read the colorized version. Yeah. So the black and white version, they're limited in that sense since they don't have the color distinction, but the way that they show Sex Bomb playing, it's not as over the top and abstract as Gem and the Holograms, but there's a sense of the way Brian Lee O'Malley draws the sound coming out of the instruments. It's jagged, it's uneven. It gives you that sense of them being that sort of 90s indie rock, shambolic, sloppy sound, which, again, if you've seen the movie, you kind of know what the songs sound like. But even just reading the book before I saw the movie, I got a sense of exactly how the band should sound. And turns out they nailed it in the movie. So I can maybe they're able to read the book and say, okay, we can kind of tell what this should sound like based on this artwork, you know?
Yeah. And the thing I really loved about the movie is how they carried that look over. Like when Sex Bomb is playing, they have the little like jagged things coming out of the instruments and out of their faces and stuff. Yeah. It's not obviously like 1-to-1 to the comic, but it's still like, obviously Edgar Wright and his editing team and stuff like that, they had a lot of respect for the comic to make sure that stuff transferred over. The thing that I always found interesting about the Scott Pilgrim books, though, is that they show the band playing, but like Brian Lee O'Malley has full like chords and lyrics in the like full pages. Like the one page that I have in our document has like the full lyrics of a song with all of the chord progressions that you would play as if you were playing the song. It blows my mind like how in depth he tried to go with that. And then from the art position, you know, he's also showing like there's a lot of energy and power coming from the band as they're playing, which is makes those scenes really exciting depending on what you're trying to get into when it comes to the music. Like he offered a lot in like just a couple of 2-page spreads, which I think is very, very cool.
And it makes me, you know, sort of wonder how much it's necessary for an artist to maybe have a background playing music or understand music theory or have some of that to kind of effectively portray that. Because sometimes, you know, drawing someone holding an instrument can look very awkward, you know, or maybe the posture isn't right. But again, if you have that musical knowledge, or at least have seen enough photos of bands or seen enough shows, you kind of know how someone should look when they're playing a certain chord. And those little details go a long way, at least for me, when you're trying to portray that stuff.
Definitely.
Let's talk about I've got 3 different tangents I could go on. Let me pick one. Okay.
Please.
So the Wicked and the Divine is a comic we've talked about at length on this show. And it is for our listeners who don't know, the Wicked and the Divine's concept is that every 90 years 12 gods are reincarnated, and this time they came back as pop stars. And so it's like, oh, we can talk about Wickdiv because that's about music. But I flipped through the first 10 issues of this series, and there's only like music being played on like 4 pages out of the first 10 volumes issues.
yeah.
Like this, you know, for a book that's about music, it's actually not about music at all. And I know that's a recurring theme in a lot of these band books, but where's the music in Wickdiv, Kieran, Jamie? Where is it? I know the answer is on their perfectly curated Spotify playlist, but like, you know, but you know, hopping back to how you were saying the movie interpretation of Scott Pilgrim kind of taking the vibe from the comic. A film that did not do that was the 2015 Gem and the Holograms film, which was bad. So bad. Nothing to do with the comic. If it had been like inspired by the comic, which was of course inspired by the cartoon in the 80s, we might have had something, but they didn't. And then they almost did at the post-credits teaser for what might have been a sequel if the first one hadn't been so terrible. And they had cast Kesha as Pizzazz in the Misfits.
Okay.
And I am so mad that movie is not the movie that got made, because Kesha as Pizzazz, if they had followed the vibe of the Gem and the Holograms comic, would have been so good. And we that's just something we'll never see. And I'm really mad about that still.
Damn you, Hollywood.
I know. Here's my third segue, which is connected, I swear. So cast your mind back to 2003. Gwen Stefani has just released Harajuku Girls. Everything's all about like that Japanese Harajuku aesthetic of like that then became like more of a cosplay being a mainstream thing of people just getting dressed up to go out and look all ruffly and corsety. And in all of this comes from Tokyo Pop, the manga Princess Ai, which is a Courtney love project. And I picked up this manga.
Okay.
Yeah, I picked up this manga when I was in middle school, like, or maybe it was early high school. I picked it off the rack in the, I guess it was a Borders RIP, and totally for the cover, read the whole series obsessively. And this book, it's like Courtney Love is credited as like part of the concept, and I think the character Princess I is like a thinly veiled version of the narrative that Courtney Love would like us to consider when we're considering her, because it's this like demon angel princess, falls to earth, doesn't know where she is, knows that she can sing, is trying to find her way, meets this handsome young nice man who's gonna help her on her way, but her power transcends his, and she's going to use her power of music to save the world. And there's lots of really beautiful aesthetics. We are coming back to the whole like comics and music in girls equals fishnets. But interesting because Courtney Love actually did write a song that ends up in this book as being sung by the main character. And there actually is there's a few songs in this series, but I thought it was interesting. Like I double checked the credit page, and Courtney Love did write a song. I am not familiar enough with her discography to know if it existed before or if it was written exclusively for the manga, but you know, it's interesting either way that they included that in there.
Yeah, interesting.
I had no idea that Courtney Love worked on a manga. In
the early 2000s, yeah.
It's described as gothic fantasy romance, but okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
Go on.
I was just going to say, so if we're going to talk about manga, that's an area of comics I'm woefully underread in. But Mike, you did drop some examples here in our show notes. I think Renee suggested a few titles. And what's really interesting is that it feels like in these manga, the way they're portraying music is the same way they portray motion in a fight. Like it looks like manga, you know what I mean? It looks like a fight scene, but they're playing instruments instead of punching each other. It's the same energy.
Yeah. I tried to grabbed a couple shots from this series called Blue Giant, or one shot from the series called Blue Giant. I don't know what the series is about, but the main character plays a saxophone, and boy oh boy, in the screenshot we've got, he looks like he's going to die. He's playing the saxophone so hard. Like he's playing out in the sun very loudly, but like there's like an energy, like Paul said, it's like a fight scene, the way that the way that it's drawn with the action lines and stuff like that. I think it's really interesting to use that same kind of shorthand that we see, like that artistic shorthand that we would understand to mean there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of movement in the scene, there's a lot of something happening, but to have it show someone doing something that we all know, like a regular thing, rather than powering up for a Kamehameha, instead it is like blasting on the saxophone over a beautiful looking river, which is what's happening in this. The other one that I grabbed was from this series called Kono Oto Tamare, and these characters, I was skimming through this one, and it looks like all of the characters play these, like, I don't know what the name of the instrument is. I couldn't find what the instrument was, but it looks like a flat harp, and you pluck upward using it, and the way, like, everyone has these little picks on their fingers, and it looks like a lot. Like whatever they're doing, it's really fast, and it seems to be very impressive and explosive. But it reminds me of Scott Pilgrim too, like in the way that Brian Lee O'Malley drew some of the energy waves coming off of Sex Bob-omb. That these people are doing the same kind of thing. And again, there's these shorthand action scenes where you see like slanted backgrounds, or you see like energy looks like it's pouring upwards from the characters, because they're doing something that's very impressive. And I noticed that in the various pieces from different manga that I saw, like this is kind of the go-to thing when they're trying to portray something really exciting. It's the same shorthand that they would use for action scenes or for quick movement scenes that are supposed to impress you. I thought that was a really interesting way, and I wish that Renee could be here today to talk a little bit more about that, because I know he loves both of these series pretty dearly.
I read a tropey manga that has a topic about music. It's called Disney's Magical Dance Volume 1. And,
oh my God.
and it's I didn't realize this when I opened it, but you know how manga sometimes have like little sidebars from the creators where they kind of like give you background on the project. So towards the end of Volume 1, Disney's Magical Dance has an aside from the illustrator Nao Kodaka, who's like, hey, so this is based off of an arcade game that's Disney Magical Dance on Dream stage, which is apparently a thing in Japan. Right. So basically they took the structure of the video game and turned it into a comic. Sound familiar, Kingdom Hearts? And it's just so bizarre, but they commit so fully to the concept. So our heroine is a 13-year-old girl named Rin, who she wants to be the very best, like no one ever was. For our American listeners who are not familiar with manga, if you recall the basic structure of the Pokemon anime that was on like WB Kids in the 90s, like you will know the basic structure of this type of manga, where it's like, I just want to succeed at this thing and I need to check these boxes and do these things before I can get there. So that structure in Magical Dance is that this girl wants to be a dancer. She's really clumsy and her school team is competing in this competition, and so she can't be clumsy anymore. So Tinkerbell appears and Tinkerbell gives our heroine these like cards with Disney characters on them, and when she activates the card, that Disney character pops out and like teaches her something about the magic of dance.
Oh my goodness.
I know. And it's just like, I'm like, okay, so in the world of this comic book, we have accepted that Disney characters exist, but they can pop into reality. And when they do that, no one is phased. Got it. So, so it was just interesting because, you know, a lot of these comics that we're talking about as examples of portraying music are about a band and the dynamics of being in a band. And this was an example that was instead it's about dancing, but this manga does talk about how and show that it's really about the rhythm and like letting the music flow through you. And like that's a lot of the stuff that the Disney characters take Rin on through her magical journey. Like she doesn't know how to swim at the beach for like a beach sequence, because every manga has like an obligatory let's go to the beach and everyone's in cute swimsuits. So Rin is like, I don't know how to swim, and so Tinkerbell gives her a card with Ariel on it, so Ariel pops out of the water, is like, let's go under the sea, and then they're just learning she's learning how to swim, because swimming is just like dancing but in the water, because it's all about rhythm.
Right. Sure.
So I thought this was a very different way of considering music in comics, because like I don't know what music is going on during this dance competition, but like through their movements and the energy of the crowd all being like, we can dance too, it's just all about having fun, yay. Well, like a Mickey firework goes off in the background, so it's like, you know. So it's going back to that whole, like, through the context cues of like how people are dressed and the style of dance they're doing, you can make you get the feel for what the energy is like in that live venue, which is what you guys were saying about, you know, Black Canary and that feeling like being at a gig.
Yeah,
definitely.
And to kind of expand on that, I maybe want to like have some counterexamples of comics that I think effectively capture that aspect without being the sort of abstracted examples like Gem and the Holograms, or where they're trying to draw the energy of the music. They're just trying to capture an aesthetic sort of moment or look of a band on stage. You know what I mean? And have it be a little more realistic and grounded. And of course, my go-to example is always going to be Love and Rockets. There's a lot of examples of Hopi, one of the main characters, who's in a band called the Jerusalem Crickets. There's a lot of great scenes of them playing, but it's not, you don't get the same visual information as you did from those other examples we have. Instead, it almost just looks like a photo of a band on stage. It's a single panel moment capturing just the way they look, the way they're holding their instruments. And that's enough to convey the vibe of what they're doing on stage, I think, because Jaime Hernandez is the greatest artist, you know, in all of comicdom. So of course it looks beautiful and looks amazing. I have a couple examples. The most famous one you could probably look up is Love and Rockets number 24. It's an iconic image of Jerusalem Crickets playing on stage. The way it's shot, you see the back of the guitar player, Terry Down. You see Hopi off to the side. You see the crowd of people. Some of them look excited. Some of them look angry. Somebody's giving the finger. It just captures the punk late 80s, early 90s aesthetic so perfectly in a single image. You can hear that chord that Terry Down is hitting on the guitar, just looking at that image. There's so much power in that. It reminds me of the photos you see of the LA punk scene of the 80s that Glenn Friedman did. And of course, Jaime was a part of that scene. He knew what was going on, and he kind of captures that feeling so well in such a different way than these other comics we've mentioned.
Yeah, I noticed that looking at the screenshots, I was like, Paul really isn't selling it with this Love and Rockets book compared to some of the other stuff. But now that you say that, like this, every snapshot that you've got in these screenshots that you have here definitely like makes me feel like I've been to this place. I've seen this band. I've been to this show where it's kind of like a divey bar place, and people, there is a raised stage, but the people are pressed right up against it. Like just that cover of Love and Rockets 24 with like the people leaning on the stage. Like you don't get that at like a big venue. You get that at like a dingy basement where like the guitarist is literally like 7 inches away from the ceiling because the place is like underneath a coffee shop or something like that. I really love the look of that thing. It definitely feels like a image of its time because the people look like they're from the 80s and early 90s. But yeah, I definitely feel I understand the aesthetic of what he was going for with these versus the energy of the others, right? Like even looking at, like again, Scott Pilgrim, or I have like a screenshot from Umbrella Academy in here as well. Like they're trying to portray the energy of the music versus a moment in time, which I think is what Love and Rockets is definitely doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like I say, Jaime played in a punk band. He did gig posters for a lot of the LA punk bands. So he's so tuned into what that looks like that, it's so realistic, having a background in that music and knowing what it sounds like, he's conveying it perfectly just from those single images. So, and I think a similar example I dropped in here was from Mike Allred's David Bowie biography, Bowie, Stardust, Ray Guns, and Moon Age Daydreams. It's a similar thing where Mike Allred has a history in music. He's done music-based comics before. All of the instruments look period correct. The clothes look period correct. It looks exactly like a photo of the band playing. And that sort of versatility, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not going to be able to say it.
Verisimilitude.
Verisimilitude. Thank you. It's one of my favorite Teenage Fan Club songs, Verisimilitude. Anyway, that helps in that sense, again, because I know David Bowie's music and I know what that sounds like just based on the way he's doing it. So he doesn't need to abstract too much. He does later on in the book, but a lot of the early images is like you hear that mid-60s British pop band right on the page just by looking at the way it's drawn. So those are some counterexamples. Again, in these examples, it kind of helps to know what that music sounds like in the first place, but I still think they're effective examples of showing how to portray that through a comic.
Yeah, because you like, even if you're only getting snippets of this, like there is an energy that those images by themselves can portray without trying to show off like the energy coming out of the voice or coming out of the microphone or coming out of the instrument, like some of the other examples that we have are. It's curious, Paul. Interesting.
I would be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to mention, of course, Josie and the Pussycats and the Archies as concepts.
Thank you.
Since those bands have been such a big part of Archie comics since the 60s. I forget if the cartoons or the concept in the comics appeared first because they happened around the same time. But that's kind of an example where it's like, hey, well, we have this music now that's attributed to this fictional band we made up. So let's just use those lyrics in this book, which is why, for the next 60 years, they've just been putting the lyrics to Sugar Sugar in their comics, which, Sugar Sugar hit #1 on the Billboard 100 for a month in 1969. Ride that forever. But so the Archies are the band that Archie, Betty, Veronica, Reggie, and Jughead comprise, and they have just perennially popped up in the Archie comics whenever there needs to be a band, and they've always been used to pretty decent effect. And it's always nice to see like, oh, Jughead's so lazy except when he's drumming. Or, people like me who read way too deeply into Archie comics. It's like, all right, so Archie's playing the guitar and he can sing. Oh, and Reggie plays every instrument you need him to. So Reggie is the more talented one. Okay. And, for a really long time, I think Betty was just like the tambourine girl, and like Veronica was on the keyboard because I guess those were the girl instruments or whatever. But and then of course there's Josie and the Pussycats, where so Josie the character existed prior to the band, and then they just gave her this total revamp where they're like, okay, instead of she's Josie, the title is now Josie and the Pussycats, and she's got Melody and Valerie in her group. And like, I always struggle to find examples of the girls being in high school, actually, because I think they're like supposed to be the same age as Archie and his friends, but they're like only rarely pictured actually at school. They're mostly just in the band, and their existence is about the band. So it was interesting with the Josie and the Pussycats series that Archie put out 3-4 years ago with Marguerite Bennett writing. And they just made it post college and just eliminated that whole thing. And like that book opened up with lyrics to a song. Like I think Marguerite Bennett wrote some original lyrics like for the Pussycats in this admittedly very strange book. Like I love Marguerite Bennett's work, but she does get meta very quickly. And that can be hard to follow for people who don't understand what references she's using. So like reading the new Josie and the Pussycats book, like it's very about the music, and like there are lyrics written in there are visual cues based on the aesthetic of the Pussycats changing outfits as they like start their band. But there's just so many like breaking the fourth wall like moments on every single page where I'm like, okay, I enjoy this. But most people would probably just be frustrated and lost. So,
right.
But again, like this focus on the music being a more literal thing, as opposed to this is not about the atmosphere. This is about here's some lyrics, and here we're talking about the dynamics of a band without making it metaphorical.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the Archies because it's the perfect mix of it's an actual band. I have several Archies records in my collection that I listen to pretty regularly. So it's a real band.
Wait,
it's also a cartoon band.
What?
And they're also in a comic book. Well, there's a whole thing, Mike. So you know the Monkees, right?
Yeah.
So the Monkees were, a put together band for the TV show. And of course they wanted to write their own music and play their own instruments. And the guy who in charge was like, I can't deal with these guys with their egos. Make a cartoon band and they won't talk back. And that's how they came up with the idea for the Archies. It's completely made up. And they got studio musicians to play on the records. And that's the idea. It's like a fictional band that actually doesn't exist.
I love it. That's amazing.
The records are great.
Josie and the Pussycats got one of the greatest albums of all time on their film soundtrack. Like
that's right.
That album is like quote unquote Josie and the Pussycats, but I think it's really Letters from Cleo. Is that right?
So. Yeah. That sounds
right.
Right.
And so but like the album totally slaps. It's like one of my favorite albums ever, and it's so good. And that's all original songs. And they're like, yeah, this is like Josie and the Pussycats. And they like sent the actors to like band camp. They didn't actually learn how to play the instruments, but they learned enough where it wouldn't look totally garbage when they were filming the movie.
This is the Josie and the Pussycats with Rosario Dawson and Tara Reid and Rachel Lee Cook. Okay. Okay.
Alan Cumming is one of those villains. Yes.
Yes, he is.
We could go on about Josie.
I always get that movie confused with Charlie's Angels for some reason, because I think they came out at like the same time, and they're both brightly colored, and there's a trio of women, but they're drastically different films because it's Cameron Diaz and Lucy Liu and Drew Barrymore. Anyways,
right. There's a joke about that though. I think Charlie's Angels came out first, and then Josie. And the most recent time I watched Josie and the Pussycats, I noticed there's like a magazine cover on a table in one scene where it is those women from Charlie's Angels, and I thought that was a really good reference.
That's great.
We'll have to, I think we could have a whole conversation about Josie and the Pussycats. We might need to add that to the list of movies for the movie club. And then Carrie might be a special guest for that one. I'm just throwing that out there.
I like that. I like that a lot.
But I will talk about Josie and the Pussycats all day.
Yeah, great.
I can tell. Me too. So
I love it.
I very briefly want to mention probably my favorite example that I pulled so far, which I think is maybe the most interesting as far as I'm concerned. It's a 3-page sequence from Jason Lute's epic book, Berlin, which chronicles pre-World War II Berlin, obviously, hence the title. But there's a 3-page sequence where he shows a jazz band, an American jazz band that's come to Berlin to perform. And there's like them performing, and it's like a 2-page spread that goes onto a 3rd page, and it's a clarinet player playing a clarinet solo. And it's quote unquote silent. He doesn't draw any musical notes. There's none of the sort of abstract sound waves coming off. All it is a series of panels where he's just showing the way the clarinet player is standing, his posture, the way he's holding the instrument, the angle of the instrument in the air. And when you look at the panels and the different sizes, you literally hear that solo. Like, it's amazing how he's able to convey the sound of the solo, the notes going up, going down, coming back around, the energy of the performance, all in just these simple panels. It's a truly stunning sequence I want to make sure we mentioned on the show.
Yeah, I'm looking at that screen grab you dropped in our notes, and it is fascinating. Like, I've only maybe seen a handful of professional clarinet players, probably only in movies, right? Right? I should say I just watched The Rocketeer, and there is a clarinet player in that, so I totally get this. And yeah, it's interesting because like there's clearly a lot of action happening, but like there's nothing else going on. But like there is like definitely a feeling of music being played, and obvious, like his facial expressions alone are enough to convey that like he's putting a lot of energy into this device or into this instrument. It's a really interesting thing. I feel like I've heard of this book a zillion times. Maybe I should actually finally check it out.
I read it maybe 2 years ago, and it's a long book. It's 400, 500 pages, but it is well worth the time and money investment to dive into that book. It's truly a masterpiece. And I remember seeing this particular image and this sequence of pages and just kind of just stopping and just taking it in panel by panel, just to try to hear that performance, as it's shown on the page. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Well, yeah, I guess I don't know. Do you guys have any final thoughts about music and comics? I know we've talked about everything, and there's obviously a handful of topics we could go into. But is there anything that we didn't cover you want to make sure we touched on?
Super, super quick. Phonogram, because Phonogram was Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey's baby before Wick Div, and that one is like even more about the music and kind of how it makes people feel. And I feel like that's a very interesting book to think about in terms of this discussion, because they're very aware of the limitations of the comic book medium. So I think Phonogram was kind of their way of saying, how do we take music, the thing we love, and turn it into a comic, the other thing we love? And they hit upon this concept of phonomancers, these people who can use music to like change how people are feeling, essentially. And they were like making these really interesting choices. And how do you convey that visually when you have no audio, but the thing you're trying to talk about is audio?
Right.
So this discussion would not be complete without a cursory mention of Phonogram.
And
That's true. Yeah, I did. While we were kind of talking here, I did go grab a screenshot from that, because there is a moment in which David basically tries to go back in time, because it's a comic book. So he has to like get into the mindset, or he's not trying to go back in time. He's trying to go back to a memory. And he basically has to go into this like old this new like DJ house that used to be like his like what he calls his sanctuary, where like he would play all of his music and be a sad emo kid. And so he's dressing the part, and he leaps as he's trying to enter this memory. And there's like this artistic take on someone falling into music, falling into the memory of music, that I think it's a beautiful shot. And yeah, Phonogram's a pretty, it's an okay read. I mean, I think like unless you're really fucking into Britpop, this book probably will just be okay for you. But I say that after only reading it like 2 or 3 times. But I don't know, Paul, you have thoughts on this?
I want to say I tried Phonogram, and again, not being too into Britpop or house music kind of fell flat for me. But it looks nice. I'll give it that much. So,
like I said, should not be absent from our broad-reaching conversation about
absolutely not
dance. On the one end, you've got Phonogram, and on the other end, you've got Disney's Magical Dance, and everything else falls somewhere in between.
Right? Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I'm sure that I'd be getting an angry talking to from Tia if we didn't bring it up on this episode. So thank you for making sure that I don't get in trouble. Well, yeah, I guess with that, I mean, Paul, I really appreciate you kind of like rounding out this topic for me, because again, I was kind of lost on it. But this is a really interesting discussion. We've got a ton of examples here. I'm going to make sure we at least drop all the titles in the show notes. So if you're curious about any of the books that we talked about today, they'll be in there. To wrap things up here, you can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Kara at Kara SM. You can follow me or Paul at Oh Hi Paula. You can follow me at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast on Twitter and Instagram.
This episode first aired on Patreon and is possible because of our wonderful patrons. Join today for exclusive series like IRCB Movie Club, Saga of Saga, and more. Join now at patreon.com/IRCB podcast.
And if you haven't already, please take a moment to rate and review the show. I think 5 stars is a pretty fair rating. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It honestly does help the show out and help us find new listeners. And you can also join the IRCB Discord community to chat about comics and pretty much anything else. You can also listen to our episodes live as we record them at ircbpodcast.com/Discord. And again, it would help us out to spread the word. If you told your friends about the show, mention it at your local comic shop, tell the world.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. We can't thank them enough for their support over the years. Xander is our editor. He's also just a great guy, just a nice person to talk to sometimes. I want to say thank you to Kara and Paul for working on this episode with me. Thank you to everyone in the Discord chat, Crashmore, Matt, and Saint, and Danny, and everyone who was able to show up today. Thank you for checking out the show live, and thank you to everyone out there listening who subscribes and shares the show. We truly appreciate your support over the many, many years of IRCB. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.